The more I work, it seems like the more they take off of me. I know if I work an extra day or 2 extra days, what they take in federal income tax alone is almost doubled, because apparently it puts you in a higher income tax bracket and it takes more off you.
Bob Crawford lives with his wife and 3 children in a suburb of Pittsburgh. They're a fairly average American family.
Don't slam the door, Daphne.
Okay. All right.
What are you doing?
Making your favorite dish.
No.
We went to the Crawfords' home after he'd spent a couple of days working out his federal and state income taxes for the year. For our benefit, he tried to estimate all the other taxes he had paid as well. In the end, though, he didn't discover much that will surprise anybody.
Inflation is going up. Everything's getting more expensive. No matter what you do, as soon as you walk out of the house, everything's going up. Your gas bills keep going up, electric bills, your gasoline. You could name 1,000 things that are going up, but just everything's going sky high. Your food. My wife goes to the grocery store. We used to live on, say, $60 or $50 every 2 weeks just for our basic food. Now it's $80 or $90 every 2 weeks. Things are just, they're going out of sight as far as expense to live on. Like I say, it's getting tough, and it seems like every month it gets worse and worse. And I don't know where it's going to end. At the end of the day, I've spent nearly $6,000 of my earnings on taxes. That leaves me with a total of $12,000 to live on. That might seem like a lot of money, but 5-6 years ago, I was earning $12,000.
How does taxation without representation really affect how much the Crawford family has left to spend after it's paid its income taxes? Well, in 1972, Bob Crawford earned $12,000. Some of that income was not subject to income tax. After paying income tax on the rest, he had this much left to spend. 6 years later, he was earning $18,000 a year. By 1978, the amount free from tax was larger, but he was now in a higher tax bracket, so his taxes went up by a larger percentage than his income. However, those dollars weren't worth anything like as much. Even his wages, let alone his income after taxes, hadn't kept up with inflation. His buying power was lower than before. That is taxation without representation in practice.
We had a number of you brothers that are sitting here today that were with us on that committee, and I'd like to tell you one of the things...
There are many traditional scapegoats blamed for inflation. How often have you heard inflation blamed on labor unions for pushing up wages? Workers, of course, don't agree.
But fellas, this is not true. This is a subterfuge. This is a myth. Your wage rates are not creating inflation.
And he's right. Higher wages are mostly a result of inflation rather than a cause of it.
Economists in this country...
Indeed, the impression that unions cause inflation arises partly because union wages are slow to react to inflation. And then there's pressure to catch up.
On a day-to-day basis, trying to represent our own members. But that, in fact, is not the case. Not only can we not play catch-up, we can't even maintain a wage rate commensurate with the cost of living that's going up in this country.
Another scapegoat for inflation is the cost of goods coming from abroad. Inflation, we're told, is imported. Higher prices abroad driving up prices at home. It's another way government can blame someone else for inflation. But this argument, too, is wrong. The prices of imports in the countries from which they come are not in terms of dollars. They're in terms of lira or yen or other foreign currencies. What happens to their prices in dollars depends on exchange rates, which in turn reflect inflation in the United States. Since 1973, some governments have had a field day blaming the Arabs for inflation. But if high oil prices were the cause of inflation, How is it that inflation has been less here in Germany, a country that must import every drop of oil and gas that it uses on the roads and in industry, than, for example, it is in the United States, which produces half of its own oil? Japan has no oil of its own at all. Yet at the very time that the Arabs were quadrupling oil prices, the Japanese people were bringing inflation down from 30 to less than 5% a year. The fallacy is to confuse particular prices, like the price of oil, with prices in general. Back at home, President Nixon understood this.
Now here's what I will not do. I will not take this nation down the road of wage and price controls, however politically expedient that may seem. Controls and rationing may seem like an easy way out, but they are really an easy way in to more trouble, to the explosion that follows when you try to clamp a lid on a rising head of steam without turning down the fire under the pot. Wage and price controls only postpone a day of reckoning, and in so doing, they rob every American of a very important part of his freedom.
Now listen to this.
The time has come for decisive action, action that will break the vicious circle of spiraling prices and costs. I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days. In addition, I call upon corporations to extend the wage price freeze to all dividends.
Many a political leader has been tempted to turn to wage and price controls, despite their repeated failure in practice. On this subject, they never seem to learn. But some lessons may be learned. That happened to British Prime Minister James Callaghan, who finally discovered that a very different economic myth was wrong. He told the Labour Party conference about it in 1976.
We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candor that that option no longer exists. It only worked on each occasion since the war by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step. That's the history of the last 20 years.
Well, it's one thing to say it. One reason why inflation does so much harm is because it affects different groups differently. Some benefit, and of course they attribute that to their own cleverness. Some are hurt, and of course they attribute that to the evil actions of other people. And the whole problem is made far worse by the false cures which government adopts, particularly wage and price controls. The garbage collectors in London felt justifiably aggrieved because their wages had not been permitted to keep pace with the cost of living. They struck, hurting not the people who imposed the controls, but their friends and neighbors who had to live with mounting piles of rat-infested garbage. Hospital attendants felt justifiably aggrieved because their wages had not been permitted to keep up with the cost of living. They struck, hurting not the people who imposed the controls, but cancer patients who were turned out of hospital beds. The attendants behaved as a group in a way they never would have behaved as individuals. One group is set against another group. The social fabric of society is torn apart, inflicting scars that it will take decades to heal, and all to no avail, because wage and price controls, far from being a cure for inflation, only make inflation worse. Within the memory of most of our political leaders, there's one vivid example of how economic ruin can be magnified by controls, and a classic demonstration of what to do when it happens.